The hedge is 6 feet of packed earth and root, and the lieutenant cannot see the men trying to kill him. He hears them. 40 yards away, maybe less, an MG-42 opens up, and the sound is not a rattle, it is a tearing, and 2 of his riflemen go down in the lane behind him and do not get up. His other platoon is somewhere to the right, past another wall of green he cannot see through. The company command post is 400 yards back through ground that is all walls and no windows. There is no runner alive who can cross that lane right now. So he does the only thing left. He reaches to the green metal box clipped to his harness, and he pulls the antenna straight up out of the top, and the set comes alive in his hand. He keys it. He says where the gun is, and a quarter-mile away, a man he cannot see writes it down. That box weighed 5 pounds, and in the summer of 1944, in the worst terrain in France, 5 pounds of American radio was doing something the most advanced army in the world had decided its lowest-ranking men did not need to do. Talk. The Germans understood radio better than anyone alive. That is the part the story usually skips. The blitzkrieg that broke France in 6 weeks did not run on tanks alone. It ran on the voice. Every German tank carried a radio. Command tanks carried 2, and sometimes 3. A panzer division moved the way it moved because the man in the lead turret could speak to the man behind him, and to the planes above him, and to the guns behind the ridge. All of it at once. All of it now. While French commanders were still sending dispatch riders, German armor was already turning inside their decision loop. The Wehrmacht did not stumble into radio. It built a doctrine on it. Radio was the nervous system of the fast war, and the Germans wired it into the part of the army that delivered the killing blow. The armor, the spearhead, the point of decision. They even had their own handhelds. The Feldfunksprecher, a small bakelite set the infantry carried for short-range talk between combat groups, and in some versions tuned so the Panzer Grenadiers could speak straight to the tanks they fought beside. Light, clever, effective. The logic was flawless. You put your best communications where your battle is won. Concentrate the voice where it decides everything. It was the correct answer to the war the Germans intended to fight. A war of movement, of breakthrough, of the lightning blow that ends a campaign before it becomes a grind. The problem was the war they actually got. Because the war that came was not won in the fist. It was won, foot by foot, in the fingers. Before the radio, the man who saw the enemy could not tell anyone. That was the wound at the center of infantry combat, and it had been bleeding since the trenches. A rifle squad spots a machine gun. The squad cannot kill it alone. The mortars can, the artillery can, the platoon on the flank can, but every one of them is somewhere else, and the only way to reach them is to send a man, a runner. You picked your fastest soldier and you sent him sprinting across open ground that the enemy was already watching, carrying in his head the one piece of information that could save the rest. And the enemy understood exactly what a running man meant, so they shot him. The runner's job was one of the most dangerous a rifleman could draw, because the message and the messenger died together, and when he fell, the information he carried fell with him into the mud, and the gun kept firing. An engineer named Don Mitchell watched this problem from the outside and saw it whole. In 1940, at Galvin Manufacturing in Chicago, the company that would become Motorola, Mitchell stood at a National Guard exercise and watched men dismount from vehicles and walk into the mock battle and leave their radios behind, bolted into trucks, abandoned in the confusion. The communications stayed with the machines. The men walked away from them into the fight, deaf and mute. Mitchell went back to Chicago with a single conviction that would define the rest of the war. Communication had to follow the man, not the truck, not the tank, the man. What he built answered the runner's death directly. The SCR-536, a Radio 1 soldier could carry and work with one hand, which mattered because his other hand was holding the thing keeping him alive. 5 pounds with the batteries in it, light enough that a man could forget it was on his harness until the second he needed it, which is exactly when a soldier has no attention to spare. No power switch to find in the dark or fumble with shaking hands. You pulled the antenna up and it turned on. You pushed it down and it turned off. The case was sealed against water because the war was wet and rain does not wait. 5 vacuum tubes inside a box a man could hold in his palm. It was self-contained, which meant there was no wire for a shell to cut, and no vehicle to lose, and nothing to leave behind when the men dismounted and walked into the fight. The channels were fixed by crystals, which sounds like a limitation, and was actually the point. There was nothing to tune, nothing to dial in under fire, nothing to get wrong. You pulled the antenna, you keyed it, you talked. A frightened 19-year-old could be taught to work it in the time it took to show him, which mattered enormously, because the men who would carry it were not trained signalmen. They were riflemen. The radio had to belong to the man at the front, not the specialist 300 yards behind him. And a device that demanded expertise would have stayed in the hands of the expert, who was never where the shooting started. And the Army built more than 130,000 of them, enough that in a division like the 29th Infantry, every rifle platoon and every company commander in the line could have a voice. America had not simply invented a smaller radio. America had decided that the lowest level leader with his eyes on the enemy was worth hearing. The beach nearly drowned the whole idea before it could prove anything. On the morning of June 6th, the Handie-Talkies came ashore in the first waves at Omaha with the men of the 29th Infantry Division, and the sea was merciless to them. Saltwater, shock, and the chaos of the landing killed sets and choked the range of the rest. On the sand in those first hours, the little AM radios struggled, and the men who lived through that morning did not remember them as miracles. They remembered them as one more thing that failed. Then the Army moved inland, and the ground changed everything. The Bocage, Norman hedgerow country. Centuries of farmers had walled every small field with banks of earth and root grown 6, 8, 10 feet high. And the Germans had turned it into the densest defensive maze in the West. In the Bocage, a man could not see the field next to the one he stood in. Platoons fought 40 yards apart and never laid eyes on each other. A company could be split into 3 blind fragments, each one convinced it was alone, each one unable to tell the others it was alive. This was terrain that punished exactly the thing armies depend on most, knowing where your own people are. And it was terrain that made a running man a dead man, because there were no open lanes that were not already covered by a gun. Every rifle company in the division carried 6 of the radios, 1 for each rifle platoon, 2 for the weapons platoon, 1 for the company commander. That distribution was the whole philosophy made physical. It meant the platoon leader, pinned behind a hedge, blind, with men bleeding in the lane, did not have to send anyone into that lane. He pulled the antenna and he spoke. He told the company commander where the gun was. The commander, just as blind, turned to the weapons platoon, and the mortars, which kill by map coordinate, not by line of sight, dropped their rounds onto a position no American eye could see, fed by a voice from a 5-pound box. And when the target was bigger than mortars could handle, the word went up the chain to the artillery net through the heavier sets behind the line, and the guns that could flatten a hedgerow answered a call that had started in the hand of a lieutenant who never saw the men he was killing. None of this made the documentaries. The hedgerow fight was not lightning. It was the opposite of lightning. It was a slow, suffocating, field-by-field killing match, and the Germans were brilliant at it. They sighted their machine guns at the corners where 2 hedgerows met, so the lanes became kill zones, and they pulled back 1 field at a time and made the Americans pay in blood for every wall. A company could take a single field and lose a dozen men doing it. In that kind of fight, the army that can coordinate its blind fragments faster than the other army can isolate and destroy them is the army that survives the day. The Handie-Talkie was what kept the fragments stitched together. The squad that found the gun could reach the men who could kill the gun in seconds without spending a runner's life to carry the words across a lane already zeroed by an MG-42. Field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, through the last weeks of June and into July, the 29th and the divisions beside them ground their way toward the road junction at St. Lo, the town that had to fall before the breakout could begin. The cost was staggering. But the thing that held the line together when the terrain tried to scatter it into 100 deft little pockets was the same thing a German officer had decided his own frontline infantry did not need. The radio did not win by range. It barely had any. It won by being there. In the right hand, at the exact moment a man had something to say and no other way on earth to say it. The Germans first held one in Sicily in 1943, when they captured American sets intact and carried them back to be studied. And the men who examined them understood immediately what they were looking at, because these were not amateurs. They were the people who had invented modern radio war. The captured American radios did not impress them with their engineering. A German signals officer could look at a 360 milliwatt AM set with a 1-mile range and see its limits clearly. His own Feldfunksprecher was, by itself, a comparable little machine. What impressed him was not the box. It was the decision the box represented. Because the American set was not rare. It was everywhere. It was in the hand of every platoon leader and every company commander in the line, by the 100,000, standard issue down to the smallest units that did the fighting. The Germans had reserved their finest communications for the armor and the spearhead, for the fist. Down at the level of the ordinary rifle squad holding a static line, the German signal system leaned hard on field telephone and wire and the runner. The same wire a shell could sever, the same runner a bullet could drop. The Americans had handed a voice to the fingers, to the small unit leader at the front, the lieutenant and the sergeant standing closest to the enemy. In the war of breakthrough the Germans had planned, their choice was correct. In the war of attrition, they were forced to fight. The grinding, blind, field-by-field war in the hedgerows and the forests and the rubble. It was the Americans who could hear themselves think. The German officer wanted that radio not because it was better. He wanted it because of what it said about the army that issued it. A weapon tells you what an army believes. The Germans believed the battle was decided at the top, in the fist, by the few. America made a different bet. America bet that the small unit leader near the bottom of the chain, the young lieutenant, the sergeant, the man nobody back home had ever heard of, was worth listening to, because he was the one who saw the enemy first. That bet is why the runner stopped dying with the message in his mouth. That bet is in your hand right now. The 5-pound box a frightened lieutenant pulled the antenna on in a Norman hedgerow is the ancestor of the handheld radio in every squad car, every cockpit, every fireground. Motorola traces its entire portable two-way radio business back to it. It was the proof of an idea we now take for granted, that one person, alone in the noise, should be able to carry a voice in his hand. If you want more of the engineering decisions and the human costs that the standard histories leave out, the ones hiding underneath the famous battles, follow this channel. Because the real story was never only in the fist. It was always in the fingers. And America was the first to listen.